Listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Election season in the U.S. means it's witch hunt season. The White House sends its thugs to harass journalists and activists who want good relations with Russia. The goal is to find signs of, quote, Russian interference, end quote, even when there aren't any. Folks, can this happen to you? Well, for insight, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest books are entitled, I Dare Say, a Gerald Horne Reader and Acknowledging Radical Histories. And the latest book is entitled
Armed Struggle, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s.
That's Dr. Gerald Horne. As always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So our fragile American democracy is easily subverted by these nefarious, quote, Russian agents, end quote. They hate us for our freedoms and want to enslave us with their communist ideology. If you listen to U.S. and NATO officials, these Russian agents are everywhere. So always be vigilant. How to discern a Russian agent? One clear sign, of course, is that they criticize the White House's policies and agitate for peace on earth. And I'll throw one more in there for you. They're against genocide. Dr. Gerald Horne, we see this happening. It has recently happened to Scott Ritter, and we know that there's a long historic context in which this is taking place.
Long historic context, indeed. Of course, when we usually talk about that historic context, our mind naturally gravitates to the example of the late, great Paul Robeson, athlete, actor, singer, linguist, socialist, and of course, Russophile. You may recall that during the bad old days of the Red Scare in the early stages of the Cold War, his passport was lifted. He was under a kind of domestic house arrest, forbidden from leaving the United States of America for fear of what he would say about the hateful, spiteful Jim Crow system, not to mention the ongoing terrorist war on the Korean Peninsula. He became a symbol of a failed foreign policy. And it's also striking to note that Paul Robeson also represents this obsession with Moscow, which has led the United States into more than one blind alley. Because, of course, the Red Scare and the Cold War both were consumed with this obsession with Moscow and the so-called hand of Moscow. Recall as well that even after Paul Robeson's passport was returned in the late 1950s, this obsession continued. When was the last time that the world came to the brink of extinction? It was in October 1962 during the so-called Cuban Missile Crisis. Why is the United States aiding the neo-Nazi Azov battalion of the Ukraine? It's because, of course, they are sworn to combat and fight Russia, Moscow. Why is Giorgia Meloni, the Prime Minister of Italy and a notorious neo-fascist, why is she a close ally of the United States of America? Why is President Biden headed to Italy as we speak to be hosted and garlanded by Prime Minister Meloni? Why was she hosted and embraced in the Oval Office in July 2023 with hardly a peep from anti-racist and anti-fascist forces? Of course, she is backing the U.S. failed enterprise against Moscow in the Ukraine. And so in order to understand why the United States continues to find itself in such danger, there's been a lot of serious personalities and analysts talking about how the world is creeping ever closer to a nuclear exchange between Russia and the United States. Some analysts even point to the recent visit of a Russian flotilla to Cuba, 90 miles off the coast of Florida, as evidentiary in that regard. Let us hope, let us work to insist that they are proven wrong, but I'm afraid to say that this obsession with Moscow, in some ways, as I've said before, it reminds me of that legendary U.S. novel, Moby Dick, by Herman Melville, and talks about how the so-called great white whale was driving this seafarer to the brink of insanity. Well, if you look at Russia on your map, in some ways it resembles a great whale, and it certainly is driving many U.S. policy analysts to the brink of insanity.
You know, Dr. Horne, it's interesting. One of the things I think particularly in this article in the Greenville Post that brought up the discussion of Paul Robeson was what happened with Scott Ritter. And if you look at Scott Ritter was involved in a program where he's supposed to go to Russia and speak at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. And then he was supposed to travel to many, many cities throughout Russia where it was kind of a goodwill tour, making friends with Russia. Russians and Americans should be coming together, kind of the same thing. And it looks like for some reason, when people make an argument that Russians and Americans, when the working class people should come together as friends, that's the final straw. That's when you're losing. That's when you're losing your passport, Dr. Horne.
Well, as your co-analyst, Dr. Wilmer Leon, suggested, it's not just Russia. Keep in mind as well that the persecution has extended to those who seek to stand in solidarity with the Palestinians. I'm thinking of the recent attack in the Washington Post on the Gray Zone, this electronic newsletter, and its leaders, including Max Blumenthal, for example. I'm thinking of the attack again in the Washington Post, which, by the way, has lost 50% of its readers in recent years, but has failed to draw the appropriate lessons and conclusions. I'm thinking of their attack on the electronic intifada in strict solidarity with the Palestinian struggle. I'm thinking of The Hill, that Capitol Hill newsletter, which also has an electronic presence online, that recently sacked its co-host, speaking of Brianna Joy Gray, because of her pro-Palestinian remarks. She was preceded by Katie Halper for the same reason. I'm thinking of the sacking of the first Black woman president of Harvard University, Claudine Gay, sacked in no small measure because she came under attack by Zionist billionaires like Bill Ackman of Persian Capital. Why, you ask? Because she was insufficiently enthusiastic about this plausible case for genocide wreaked by Israel and historic Palestine. I'm thinking of the thugs unleashed on the UCLA campus on April 30th, 2024, breaking up violently a pro-Palestinian encampment. I'm thinking of the cops unleashed at Emory University, at Dartmouth in New Hampshire, at the University of Texas at Austin, all targeting pro-Palestinian supporters. I'm also thinking of the recently published report by China, which I recommend to your listeners, on violations of U.S. human rights, which speaks of many of the items I've just referenced, and then tosses in, of course, that ongoing question of police terror against Black communities, hate crimes against Black communities and the Asian American community. It's quite a sobering and ugly picture, but alas, rather than address its pressing domestic problems, the United States and many of its minions prefer to attack those who are raising their voices against pressing global questions, not least the Palestinian question.
At the height of Paul Robeson's career, I want to say he was making about $100,000 in 1947. And for an African American, that was an incredible amount of money. I want to say it would equate today to be about almost $1.5 million in 2024 dollars. He went from $100,000 a year income to next to nothing after the United States took his passport, denied him the right to travel. Talk about the message that sends to the rest of the so-called left, or whoever it is that the United States decides that it wants to put in its crosshairs. What's the messaging here?
Well, the message is that the safer course is anti-Sovietism, anti-Moscow ethos. The safer course is anti-communism. The safer course is turning against socialism rather than endorsing socialism. And what is even worse, perhaps, is that it would be one thing if Robeson's case was a sole, solitary, isolated case, but of course it was not. One of his closest comrades was W.E.B. Du Bois, a founder of Pan-Africanism, a founder of the NAACP, sacked by that latter organization in 1948 because of his reluctance to go along with the Red Scare and the Cold War, handcuffed and put on jail and put in jail in 1951, and of course escaping an extended imprisonment, not least because of a mass movement. What was the cause? He was charged with being the agent of a foreign power, presumed to be Moscow, because he was against the proliferation of nuclear weapons. That eventually drove him into exile in Ghana, West Africa, by 1961, where he died in 1963. Ultimately, he was accompanied by a close comrade of both Robeson and Du Bois. I'm speaking of W. Alpheus Hunton, a former resident of Washington, D.C., former professor at Howard University, a former comrade of Robeson and Du Bois in the Council on African Affairs. He, too, was jailed temporarily, fortunately, but he, too, was driven into exile and, of course, died in Zambia in southern Africa in the early 1960s, where the founding father, Kenneth Kaunda, wept openly at his gravesite. This is the rather unfortunate story of those who refuse to toe the line and sail into the stiff breezes of anti-communism and anti-Moscow insanity.
And Dr. Horne, I think it is also important if you could comment on what's happening with the Uhuru movement and your thoughts on how that is related to this conversation.
Well, it shows that the more things change, the more they remain the same. You gentlemen, I'm sure, are more than familiar with the case of the African People's Socialist Party, Chairman Omali Yeshitela, who for the last year or so have been figuratively under the gun, supposedly, because they too allegedly, purportedly, supposedly, are acting as agents of Moscow because of their stern opposition to police terror and their stern opposition to U.S. foreign policy, particularly as it manifests itself in terms of war abroad. And so the United States refuses to learn the lessons, although the lessons are stark and clear and are written, I'm afraid to say, oftentimes in the blood of our ancestors.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.